In 1920, George Spencer Cleveland was born in Newark, New Jersey, the first of 4 children. His father, Spencer, worked with precious metals for dentistry. His mother was a homemaker. Early on, the family moved to Nutley, New Jersey, where George and his siblings were raised and went to school and church. George often played on the church softball and bowling teams. George remembers that his mother convinced him to take piano lessons, and although it was not his favorite thing, he kept at it for 5 or 6 years. It turned out to be worthwhile because George got to play the piano with the music groups in high school. As a teenager during the Depression, George remembers picking beans for 5 cents a bushel, a fact he loved to remind his kids of. At his junior high school graduation, the dress code was blue jacket and white shoes. His mother had to borrow a jacket, and George used chalk on his tennis shoes to turn them white. Athletic and amicable, George graduated high school in 1938 and found work as a clerk at insurance giant Mutual Benefit. George described it as a good job, if not a bit boring. As war began to loom in Europe, George signed up for the Army Air Corps. The date was December 6, 1941, the day before the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. The country was going to war. George was a young man of 21. Early in 1942, George took a train to Texas and Kelly Field for primary flight training. His first airship was a PT-19. He performed vertical turns, chandelles, lazy eights, stalls and spins, repeating his landings and takeoffs over and over.
All my training was what they call the Gulf Coast area, all in Texas area. Mm-hmm. So I went through pre-flight training there, pre-flight first. Then I went to a little place called Uvalde, Texas for primary. Waco, Texas for basic. And Lubbock, Texas for advanced training. I graduated from Lubbock and at that time, pilots that completed the training and graduated, where we were commissioned second lieutenants, got our silver wings, and that was it. You were an officer and a gentleman by an act of Congress.
Mostly, George put in a good performance learning how to fly, and eventually he did solo. At least his diary informs us so. Over 1942 and into 43, George moved through basic and advanced training at bases in Texas, Idaho, and Utah. Often ready on the flight line, terrific rainstorms, dust storms, fog, or wind would cancel flying for the day. Sometimes there weren't enough ships or parts. Training simulators were the go-to back then. Ground school and lectures came daily. George would read manuals, study, and test. In Waco, Texas, George trained on the single-engine BT-13. Downtime was filled with ping pong and pool, bowling and softball, sack time and letter writing. Some nights there was a movie or a show. In town or on base, there were dates, dancing, and other diversions to pass the time, much of it very enjoyable. There were even a few surprise trips back home, like the furlough George took after his appendix was removed. These were short but welcome reunions with family, bookended by long days of train travel each way. After completing advanced training on the twin-engine AT-9, George graduated to second lieutenant. His family traveled by train from New Jersey to Lubbock, Texas for the graduation. His mother was proud to pin on George's wings and bars. Transferred to an airbase outside of Boise, Idaho, flying wasn't the only thing to do. George got to ride horseback, shoot skeet, and hunt rabbits. Later, he even qualified as a sharpshooter with a .45 caliber automatic. In Boise, George was privileged to serve under the actor and pilot Captain Jimmy Stewart as squadron commander. George learned to fly at night and land with one engine out. He practiced instrument flying under the hood. He learned how to ditch a plane at sea, all the things he might need to do to survive in war. By the time George transferred to Wendover, Utah, B-24 training included exercises in high-altitude formation flying, long-range navigation, and target identification. A city of salt and other targets were built on the Bonneville Salt Flats for simulated combat missions. George flew cross-country runs on calibration and gunnery missions, both day and night. His crew practiced target bombing from 15,000 feet. Once, during pre-flight inspection, George, as ship commander, was outside near the bomb bay doors. Suddenly, the entire load of 100-pound bombs was released. The bombardier accidentally hit the salvo button and 20 unarmed Blue Beetles dropped from the bay, only inches away from George. In Europe and in the Pacific, the mood darkened as conflicts escalated. The pressures of duty were growing daily. Accidents happened. An explosion in the aircraft's nose, a tire blowout on takeoff, a failed oxygen mask, and the bends. During this uncertain time, aviators needed all the motivation they could get, so a lady was painted on the nose of this B-24 for inspiration. USO dances at Wendover brought the girls out from Salt Lake City to the base. It was the summer of '43, and as George tells it, I set my eyes on a tall blonde girl in a stunning red dress. She really stood out from all the rest. We danced and talked and learned some things about each other. In time, this relationship would blossom.
1943. We had a dance at the Officers Club, and I was stationed in Wendover, Utah, which was right on the Utah-Nevada borderline, just west, 125 miles or so west of Salt Lake City. And the girls from Salt Lake had an organization, I don't know what it was there. They used to come out, so I don't know how they worked it. They come out by bus on Saturday night to our dance. And the base had put them up overnight and feed them breakfast in the morning, and then they'd go back into Salt Lake by bus. So every Saturday night, a whole group of girls came out on the bus for our dances and everything. And I think about one of the second dances, I met her. In fact, the first dance, I met her best girlfriend. Boy, I didn't quite know how to handle that, the second time around. He says, I met a girl here the first time. I give her a name. Whoa, they went to school together. She's my best friend and all that. I said, whoa, what am I getting myself in for here? Oh, gee, it worked out fine.
In 1944, George was but one of the 2.5 million men and women serving in the Army Air Corps. Nearly 80,000 aircraft on hundreds of bases supported the war effort. The development of the atomic bomb was underway, and the B-29 bomber was selected to deliver it if needed. Due to its isolation in the desert, Wendover was chosen as the spot to test the weapon and train the crew. So the B-24 groups at Wendover evacuated, and George relocated to the March Field in Riverside, California, for the remainder of his active duty service. In his words, "We were delighted to leave that godforsaken place." But sad to leave Joni behind in Salt Lake. They kept in contact by mail to keep the spark alive. March Field was in the business of training air crews, and from there, many shipped out to war in Europe or in the Pacific. George was fortunate to become a trainer of bomber pilots, which meant he never had to deploy overseas. Many of those he trained had different stories. Joan traveled from Salt Lake to California to live with her sister Irene in Bellflower, near Long Beach. In George's words, she connived with her sister to move in, if it was alright with me. When Joan told me about this arrangement with her sister, I really didn't know what to make of it. I was quite surprised and didn't know how I felt about this or what to say. I did think, though, that this was beginning to sound serious, and I had better make up my mind whether I wanted this. Was I in love? Was she in love with me? Wow, this could be serious stuff. Joan was so positive and decidedly Danish in her determination to be with George. George finally came out from behind the tree with a ring and a proposal. As George describes it, I told her that I had brought a souvenir back from New Jersey for her, but there was one condition that went with it. She had to agree to be my wife before I would give it to her. Her face lit up like a Christmas tree, and I got the biggest hug and kiss she could muster up. They married in Long Beach in June of 1944. Unfortunately, the military gave George no time for a honeymoon. Worse yet, the car they borrowed for their wedding night ran out of gas. Despite all this, they regarded it as a great beginning to a wonderful 51-year marriage. George would later recall, "Our love for each other grew over the years. She was the best wife a man could hope for, and the very best mother to our children." VE Day came in May of 1945, and tensions were finally winding down. By VJ Day in August, the war was over. George mustered out, traveling cross-country with his new wife and firstborn boy back to New Jersey. With a family to support now, George soon found work flying for Eastern Airlines. Eastern was run by World War I flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker, who pushed the airline into a period of growth and innovation. George's career would take off with it. He flew just about every prop and jet in the Eastern Fleet. The Lockheed Constellation, the Electra, the workhorse DC-3. Years later, George would be surprised to see the very same DC-3 he had often flown hanging as a piece of history in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. In the early days, George flew puddle jumps, as well as longer trips, mostly around the eastern US and Canada. Schedules and routes were always shifting. Crew schedule called him in to work many holidays and at odd hours. Over time, George gained seniority and began to fly jets exclusively. Manual reading, simulators, and check rides were a constant part of his career. A few perks accrued to the family of a commercial airline pilot. George and the family took pass rides on Eastern, on getaway trips and vacations. Florida and the Caribbean, Bermuda and Texas. These were just a few of those destinations. Going standby with a family of 6, however, was not always easy. So George often packed the car and took the family on summer vacations to places like the Jersey Shore, New York, and New England. They would rent a place for the week, relax, and enjoy the change of scenery. It was a time for family to be together and enjoy each other's company. During the latter part of his career, George flew as captain on the Lockheed L-1011, known as the Whisper Jet and often described as an over-engineered masterpiece. George called it a pleasure to fly. It was a luxury liner that carried up to 300 passengers to destinations like Puerto Rico, Bermuda, and Mexico. It was the height of air travel back then, and George was a senior pilot. One of those pilot stories George likes to tell on occasion was an L-1011 flight into Tampa, Florida. the plane came to a stop out on the ramp and the passengers debarked down the air stairs. As George tells it, "We completed our paperwork in the cockpit, grabbed our flight bags, then walked back through the now empty cabin to deplane. When I got to the door and stepped out onto the air stairs, there were 6 lady flight attendants standing there with pillows stuffed under their jackets, looking like they were 9 months pregnant, all pointing their fingers at me, saying, 'He did it! He did it!'" George claims he was a bit embarrassed, and perhaps he even blushed. But later on, he was heard to say, "Hey, it's all in a day's work." George's eldest son, Russ, who had been trained as a fighter pilot, also came to work for Eastern. In 1980, George was turning 60, and the mandatory retirement loomed. In the last month before his August birthday, George experienced one of the highlights of his career. As George tells it,
I think actually my really proudest moment was when my oldest boy flew with me on my last month of flying. He was a crew member on the same airplane I was. And I thought that was the height of my whole aviation career, that to have my own son with me as a crew member.
Do you remember what year that was?
1980.
19?
August 1980, because I had to retire on my birthday. That was the federal regulation at the time there, that you reached age 60, that you couldn't do it anymore commercially.
Okay.
So I knew it was coming. So,
As a family, do you guys have any traditions? Like
traditions? No, I don't think so, really. No family traditions or anything like that. We just like to do things together. We had went on vacations together. And, no, we just whenever we were together and doing something different, I think everybody enjoyed it. So.
what a nice end to a memorable career. But before we put George into retirement, let's rewind a bit and take a closer look at those beloved times he spent with his wife and children. Vivacious, warm, and caring, George's wife Joni was a homemaker, a hospital pink lady volunteer, and a wonderful mother. With lots of legs and always a laugh, Joni got along with everyone. Later, she became a self-taught expert at antique furniture refinishing, quilting, and sewing. Not long after Russ came along, the family grew to 2, and then to 3, and finally to 4 children. The family was complete. Extended family was always part of the mix, with George's family in the east and Joni's family in the west. The family trees were growing, and over the years they found time to stay connected. There were many occasions for reunions. By the 50s, George decided to buy a lot and build a house in a private lake community about 25 miles west of New York. George was hands-on, moving dirt, building walls, and pouring concrete. Landscaping the hilly property was a challenge, but he made it happen. Inside, he built out a finished basement, a workshop, laundry, and closets, all of which he accomplished on days off. It was a labor of love, the home where the family would live and grow over the next 23 years. A favorite activity for George was sailing on the lake in races and at regattas around the state. George went for a Comet-class boat, where all boats were built to identical specs. That way, it was the skill of the sailor, the man at the tiller, that would win in the competition. Every Sunday George could get off from work, he was out racing his Comet, often pressing his kids into service as crew. The athletics of George's youth always stayed with him, including a passion for tennis, archery, pool, and horseshoes. Rarely could he be beat at these, but it was always good sport. Later in retirement, George excelled at bowling and golf. He also learned to downhill ski at the age of 68. which then became a favorite family activity in the mountains of Vermont and the Poconos. Flying was always George's passion, even in his off hours and well into retirement. Once he could afford it, he bought a small Cessna. The family got to see life from the air, bouncing around on short trips. Flying was a thrill the family shared together. Soon, George upgraded to a sleeker, faster aircraft, a single-engine Beech Bonanza. He took the family on outings to air shows and flying vacations. There were trips to college and back again. The plane became the family's second station wagon. One of the family's favorite destinations was Block Island. Off the coast of Rhode Island, Block Island became the family's summer getaway. With its small airport, George could fly the Bonanza in with family and everything needed. The house was a small A-frame, set in a pastoral scene of ponds and old rock walls, windy roads, bluffs, and windswept beaches. It was a place to take it slow and have fun. When George retired in 1980, the family moved to Long Valley in western New Jersey. By then, most of George's children had married and started their own families and careers. The youngest, Tom, was still at home, the third wheel to his mom and dad. George set up a workshop downstairs, and Joan refinished furniture and sewed. George bowled in the league. Retirement was off to a good start, with trips to Block Island and later to a new summer place in the Pennsylvania Poconos called the Hideout. Sadly, in 1995, his wife of 51 years, Joni, passed away. George became a lonely bachelor. George remarried a few years later to Dot, the widow of a bowling buddy who had also recently passed away. A life of travels ensued, to global destinations and to visits with his children and many grandchildren. 11 years with Dot were filled with common interests and companionship. When Dot passed away in 2008, George recalled fondly of her pioneer spirit and zest for life. George was on his own again. Soon he made the move into a senior living apartment where he now takes on this new phase of life with just as much spirit and humor, grace and elan as always. And thankfully, he's been thriving there, making friends and telling stories, shooting pool, and taking bets on Derby Day. Certainly very gratifying, George has seen not only his son follow in his footsteps as an aviator, but also his first grandchild, Scott, who now makes his career in the Air National Guard. Here, Scott is engaging a B-52 on a refueling mission over the Middle East. On George's 90th birthday, it was back in the air again with his eldest son, Russ. The equipment was a DC-6, and the ride, this time as a passenger, was perhaps just as exciting as George's first time up in the air. He might even say, as he did back in 1942, that flying was a great thrill and a memorable experience. The year is now 2020. Today, the 31st of August, George turns an incredible 100 years old. He's certainly seen and accomplished much in life. His career legacy and that of his 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and soon to be 12 great-grandchildren are something of a wonder, and certainly a joy. So today we celebrate with delight and respect, proud to be a part of George's family. With our warmest, best wishes, happy birthday, George. Congratulations, and we all love you so much.